I'm recording this in the week leading up to Remembrance Sunday. War is hell. That's the verdict of so many people who have experienced war in its conditions and its dreadfulness, and the number of people who have been killed as a result of 2 world wars and other conflicts. War is hell, and no matter how much we try to dress it up, that's the reality. And for so many people it was made even more hellish in a sense, because of the sense that God had gone away and God had left us to suffer in these dreadful places. The Creed tells us that Jesus descended into hell. Now, some versions of the Creed have taken out that reference because I suspect the culture that we live in doesn't like the idea anymore. But I think the gospel needs it, and I think we need to understand what it means for Jesus to descend into hell. One of the great delights of Jesus' life and ministry was the sense of oneness that he shared with his Father, the love that they shared together, and that sense, that bond of being together, that unity that Father and Son together shared. And he often referred to the notion of being one with the Father. And yet on the cross, Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Now these words come from Psalm 22 and reflect one man's experience of being forsaken by God through his life. And yet these are now Jesus' words. Jesus having a sense of being excluded from his Father's presence and being cut off from the Father. And that is what hell is. It's not a place, it's a condition. It's a condition of being excluded from the presence of God and being cut off from his love. And Jesus says on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And to understand what that means, we need to understand a little bit of ourselves. All through the story of human history, there have been 2 things that we have recognized as human beings. One is the need for God, and the other is the desire to live without God. We have wanted as human beings so much to do our own thing and not to feel constrained by God or anything else. And so we have tried to push God out of our lives or to the margins of our lives so that we can be free and that we can rule our own lives. And that's what sin is. Sin is that kind of rebellion against God, and because of that we make mistakes and get things wrong. But we understand what hell is when we begin to realize that these misdeeds and mistakes have consequences for us. And on the cross, Jesus deals with these consequences. My God, why have you forsaken me?" is his dealing with the consequences of our trying to push God out and trying to exclude God from our lives, the consequences of our sin. And so Jesus takes on himself that sense of being excluded from the presence of God so that we never need to. There are times when these words, my God, why have you forsaken me?" become our words, because we have a sense that life is hellish for us and that somehow God has gone away. The gospel, however, tells us that because Jesus had that experience, he knows what that feels like for us, and so is able to help us. And because he had that experience, actually we never need to have that experience. The gospel tells us that God is with us wherever we go, even in the darkest places of our lives, even when we don't realize that God is there. And the gospel also tells us that we are children loved by God, with a love that nothing can separate us from. And so we need never to have that experience of being forsaken or excluded from God's presence, because Jesus has been there and has taken that on himself. I want to finish by reading some words from a poem called Jesus of the Scars, to go back to the sense of war as being hell. And these words come from the time of the First World War, written by a man called Edward Shillito, about whom we know very little. The poem is called Jesus of the Scars, and this is the last verse of that poem. Thinking of God in his place in that war. He writes, "The other gods were strong, but thou wast weak. They rode, but thou didst stumble to a throne. But to our wounds, only God's wounds can speak, and not a god has wounds, but thou alone."